This workshop focuses on the concept of communication strategies. In part 1, we discuss the traditional view of strategies and then problematize the ideas in light of what people do in interaction, relocating the idea from being a purely psycholinguistic concept to one that sees strategies as a social phenomenon. In part 2, we take a look at some actual conversation analytic data to see strategies in action.
But I do think it's worth talking about what this idea, what we tend to think of as strategies, because as teachers we think of them in terms of strategies oftentimes. And as learners, we oftentimes think of them as strategies. So it's obviously a term that we know and that we're comfortable with on a layperson level, right? And that's kind of why we're going to jump into it this way. The goals, one is to kind of reconsider the notion of communication strategy, to kind of re-specify it, rethink it a bit. To draw attention to how resources can be assembled and recycled and built upon. And also to kind of identify the relevance of this topic for L2 teaching in terms of adding to the learner's toolkits. And then kind of the teachability of strategies, accessibility of strategies, things like that. So communication strategies, this thing that you've been warned not to talk about. Let's talk about it. What are your views? I'd like you to kind of talk with each other for a few minutes, just to your neighbors. What is a communication strategy, or what makes a strategy a strategy? Are they good for learners to employ, or are they something that we want learners to avoid? And are they teachable? And if they are teachable, should we teach them?
The Common European Framework of Reference for Languages describes communication strategies as functioning to fulfill the demands of communication in context and successfully complete the task in question in the most comprehensive or most economical way feasible, depending on his or her precise purpose. It continues on to make a very important point, one that aligns with recent work on interactional competence and social approaches to researching language use and learning, when it says that communication strategies should therefore not be viewed simply with a disability model as a way of making up for a language deficit or a miscommunication.
Right. Communication strategies aren't proof of a learner being a failed native speaker, right? They actually are productive, they're successful. And so instead of thinking of them as being a sign of somebody who hasn't reached proper proficiency yet. And so I feel this is very important. This is a very strong point to be made. But at the same time, on the same page, they provide this graph. And they talk about strategies relating to identifying cues and inferencing, taking the floor, cooperating, asking for clarification, planning, compensating. Wait a second, didn't they just say not to look at it that way? And then monitoring and repair. Well, the identifying cues and inferring, the taking the floor, cooperating, asking for clarification, why bother thinking of those as strategies at all? They're just what we do. They're practices, right? They're the things we do regardless of first language, second language, whatever. These relate to the traditional view of communication strategies. 1, potentially conscious. Point of that potentially in parentheses is that no one ever seemed to agree on this. And the idea that, well, it can't be a strategy unless you know what you're doing, unless you know that you're doing it, right? But then that discounts automatization, which is not an on and off switch. Right? Things can be partially automatized. Where do you draw that line? And so they hedged that by putting parentheses around potentially. Planned, goal-oriented, right? These are things that, to be a strategy, this has to be there. And the literature that I'm drawing off of, these are people like Canali and Swain, Dornier, the Ferrick and Casper book from 1983, Eric Kellerman's work, all this kind of stuff. These are where these definitions are coming from. And then one that comes up all the time is that they're compensatory, they're compensating, they're making up for something that the learner doesn't know.
Let's take a couple moments to question these definitions. In interaction, how can we tell if something someone else has done was done consciously or not? And does it really matter if it is? What matters is that an action is publicly visible. Or take the idea that a strategy must be planned and goal-oriented. Certainly, from our lay understanding of the concept, this makes sense. Someone playing chess haphazardly wouldn't be described as having a strategy. However, we have to be careful not to impose our own ideas of goals from the outside. The learner's goals may not be ours as teachers. Furthermore, when does the planning happen? Have you ever planned out a conversation in advance? How often did that conversation go as you expected? These plans must be flexible and sensitive to contingencies, and therefore must happen in real time. Lastly, there's the view that strategies make up for a deficiency, something that is missing. But who is to judge this? From an etic or outside viewpoint, based on what we expect are the goals, we may see something is missing that the learners themselves don't treat as such. Again, what matters is that the action is publicly visible, and since we can't get into the learners' heads, we don't necessarily have access to whether something is compensatory or not.
And let's reconsider the notion of communication strategies in this way. So if the goal of language learning is to be able to interact, which I think most of us can probably agree on, right? It's not about passing tests necessarily. And the more interaction that we have, the more input that we get, on and on, recursively. And the goal of interaction is generally intersubjectivity, mutual understanding. We know that sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes we're purposefully deceptive. But for the most part, it's mutual understanding or something close. If this is the case, then the things that we consider as productive strategies are simply the methods and resources, the practices for achieving intersubjectivity. At the same time, we do recognize, just as speakers of the language, and sometimes there are strategies, right? And I do think it's important that we recognize that there is something that as lay people, we recognize as such, right? So that's why I don't say, let's get rid of that term, no, you're not allowed to use the word strategy. No, because we recognize it as a concept. And it's an important concept. All of us as learners have always had to kind of think of these things. That metaphor, that toolkit metaphor that we were talking about earlier. This is the metaphor that I use for my classes, or for my language classes oftentimes. So the idea that you're outside of a locked room that you absolutely must get into.
Go ahead and pause the video for a moment. As part of this exercise, what tools or methods did you think of? This audience, and many before, came up with tools such as a hammer, or suggested breaking a window, or using a credit card, or an axe, or a screwdriver, or even simply knocking on the door to see if anyone was inside.
All these methods, they may not be clean or efficient, right? If you use that hammer or you use the axe, you know, there's a mess to clean up, right? You may have to apologize, but they still get you in the room, right? And this is a metaphor, this toolkit metaphor, that I oftentimes use, and that seems similar to what Sylvia has talked about as well. So all linguistic and communicative resources are tools for an interactional job, right? They're getting a job done. Some work better than others, and all of us have experienced this, right? Where we use a resource that maybe wasn't necessarily the best resource to use at the time, but, you know, it got the job done, maybe with a little embarrassment, right? And then the use of one that doesn't work, since it keeps the channel open, may lead to the chance of getting one that actually works better. You learn within the interaction something that would fit better. And this goes for grammar, vocabulary, constructions, pragmatic formulas, discourse connectors, repair initiations, action formulations, everything, right? They're all fit to the situation, but sometimes we don't have the right one fit to the situation.
As a case in point, Stephen Levinson, in his 2006 chapter on the interaction engine, tells the story of talking with a man while he was doing field work in a village on Russell Island in eastern Papua New Guinea. One day, when most of the villagers were gone, the man, who was both deaf and mute, came to Levinson and began to quote-unquote speak with him. Levinson points out that they were able to reach a remarkable level of mutual understanding, despite sharing no language, very little culture, and only a little bit of background knowledge. This level of understanding was accomplished through a variety of resources and actions, including pointing, iconic gestures, and mime. In other words, the very things we tend to think of as communication strategies. We could look at these as making up for their lack of shared language, but that may be putting the cart before the horse. In an earlier work, Levinson states that language didn't make interactional intelligence possible. It is the interactional intelligence that made language possible as a means of communication. To take this a step further, the goal is to interact and to understand each other. Language isn't the goal. It is the resource to get there. Levinson proposed what he called an interaction engine and described a number of interactional phenomena that arise from it. For our purposes here, a number of these help draw our focus to the very things we do with language. The first of these is that we respond to and interpret other people's actions. It isn't so much what they say as it is what they're doing by saying it. We also design what we say for our recipients, orienting to what we expect they will know, think, or feel. Third, language is just one of the ways we conduct meaningful action. When needed, we can often come up with alternative approaches, including the home sign systems that deaf children of hearing parents often devise, or Levinson's own example discussed earlier. Next, our interactions are generally cooperative, even our arguments. We design what we say to be interpretable and to contribute to some larger joint undertaking. Our contributions to these joint undertakings are generally sequenced, and these sequences are governed not by rules but by expectations. For example, although one generally responds to an invitation with an acceptance or a refusal, there are other possible responses. Furthermore, these sequences must be sensitive to contingencies, as we discussed earlier. The next is the fact that our roles shift in interaction. Sometimes we are speakers, sometimes the recipients. Sometimes we're the ones asking questions, and sometimes we're the ones answering. For the most part, this takes place rather seamlessly, with little difficulty. Not only do our roles shift in interaction, our participation does as well. We can be on the sidelines as ratified overhearers, and then called upon to participate as a speaker in the conversation. When taking turns, the timing between the turns is remarkably close, oftentimes within 0.2 and 0.5 of a second. This is so expected and normative that if the gap between turns is longer, we often interpret it as meaningful. Further phenomena that we interpret as meaningful in interaction include gesture, posture, facial expressions, movements, and quality and tone of voice. When we're involved in face-to-face interaction, we attend to all of these, and they influence how we understand what the other person is doing. Lastly, many of these phenomena are remarkably similar across languages and cultures. There may be cultural and personal variations in how they manifest, but by and large, they are part of interaction the world over. If we take this perspective, putting interaction first and seeing language as one of the many tools we use to understand each other, the things we often think of as communication strategies are really just the things we as humans do to make sure we're getting the job of interaction done.
So returning to that idea of communication strategies very quickly. So productive strategies, as opposed to avoidance, are aimed at achieving intersubjectivity, the point of interaction. In other words, practices. As such, they're inextricably linked to the elements that we've talked about with Levinson's interaction engine. Again, this idea of practices, right? And they also exhibit the use of a wide variety of resources and materials, this bricolage, bringing things together. And they're, most importantly, cooperative and keeping the channel open, providing opportunities for going.